Welcome to Play It by Tier, a series created by the Switch Clicks. In this series, we review a variety of games, movies, and other media, and we will be placing each of these onto a tier list based on the category. Back in our very first episode, we reviewed Hyrule Warriors: Age of Calamity, and the game was ranked B on our tier list. However, this was done before any major content updates were announced. If you haven't watched it already, I highly recommend you do so, as this episode will focus on the other aspects of the game. The link to the first episode will be in the description, and you can also find it at the bottom of our Play It by Tier playlist on our channel. In this episode, we will be covering the DLC for the game, known as Pulse of the Ancients and Guardian of Remembrance. At the end of this video, we will determine whether the game's ranking will go up, down, or stay the same. There will be spoilers for Guardian of Remembrance. You have been warned. One thing that wasn't covered much in depth in the last episode was the difficulty of the game. Compared to the first Hyrule Warriors game, Age of Calamity felt very handicapped and much less chaotic, almost not chaotic enough to present any sort of real challenge to the player. Increasing the difficulty would only increase the health of the enemies and the damage they deal to the player, but the level structure and overall gameplay did not change. The expansion pass bonus was more or less something aesthetic rather than something worth grinding levels for. But I did it anyways, just for the heck of it. There was a free update that came out around the same time as DLC 1, but this was where I found myself very disappointed given the amount of time I potentially wasted. They raised the weapon level cap from level 30 to level 50. It's not necessarily anything bad, considering the game's already overinflated with powerful techniques and weapons, but there was just no point in keeping us away from a higher level, if some players were going to reach that higher level regardless. Then came the first DLC, which introduced a variety of features that would add challenge to the present game. Other than adding one more difficulty level, which should have been free in the first place, the DLC introduced a new challenge mission where you have to fight incredibly buffed enemies. While fun at first, these missions sometimes take a ludicrous amount of time to complete, just because the final boss at the end of these missions hold an insane amount of health. Not only that, but they are mandatory if you want to complete the full DLC 1. I spent about 50 hours trying to get this entire DLC finished just because those missions were mandatory. And the result was an unlockable character that no one wanted, but I guess it was a welcome surprise. The DLC also added two new weapon types, the Flail and the Master Cycle, which was from Breath of the Wild. Both weapons are more or less gimmicks than something worth using though. They aren't necessarily bad, but they could take a while to learn how to use. And the end result isn't overly that exciting. There were many small other quality of life improvements locked behind the DLC, but none too game-breaking for me to complain about. The DLC was just another indicator that I needed to grind more time into the game in order to be considered a completionist. Not that I really have any time to do all that. There was one redeeming factor, and I mentioned this earlier. It was the secret unlockable character. It also turned out to be a boss fight. This is the boss fight that you can access once you complete every DLC side quest, and oh boy, this may very well be the true test of your skills at Age of Calamity. The boss happens to be the unlockable character known as the battle-tested Guardian. This isn't your ordinary Guardian, and by now, you'd think that fighting Guardians is a complete joke in both games. You thought wrong. This boss is an absolute nightmare. This boss attacks much faster than a regular Guardian, and it can also jump and do all these fancy moves. But most importantly, if you think back to Breath of the Wild when you could deflect the lasers that the Guardians shoot out, that is honestly the biggest mistake you'd ever make fighting against this boss. This boss is able to deflect back the lasers that you shield bashed. As the end result, it becomes a laser tennis match, which I think some Zelda fans would call Dead Man's Volley. This boss has so much health, and you need pretty fast reaction time if you want to fight against this boss. Heck, I would even consider this to be the most difficult enemy in the entire game. More difficult than Lionel's, more difficult than Mal's enemies, more difficult than the final boss. Overall, the first DLC was okay. It featured some amount of content. I guess the difficulty level added maybe 100 hours to the game, but not much content was really added. That's where all my expectations went towards the second DLC of the game. Maybe it's those high expectations, or maybe it's just that huge desire of not wanting to see the same mistakes repeat itself. But the second DLC of Age of Calamity is more or less a tease than something actually substantial. It answered a few questions, but generated a whole lot more. And it failed to justify Age of Calamity's placement on the Zelda timeline. by making one of the biggest inconsistencies in the game look even worse now. But my biggest complaint, which is also my biggest praise, is how this DLC is rather short. It's that kind of thing that gives you fun in a short burst that you'd be begging for more, because there simply wasn't enough content to be completely satisfied. However, I think it was done intentionally in wake of a certain upcoming game, a game that we were all anticipating since 2019. Anyways, onto the actual gameplay. Gameplay aspects of this DLC was much better than what was introduced in DLC 1. We got playable characters we actually wanted to play as, and a bit of something new sprinkled at the end. I wouldn't necessarily classify this as a secret boss in comparison to the Guardian from before, but it sure as heck still had a surprise factor. Who knew that Calamity Ganon was going to take on yet another form? This form of him is known as Mutated Ganon, and he's basically a hybrid between Harbinger Ganon and the Breath of the Wild version of Calamity Ganon. Think of that huge mechanical beast you see in Breath of the Wild, and combine that with the powers of a Guardian from Age of Calamity. In that, you get Mutated Ganon. And to top all that, this boss played much like a traditional Zelda boss battle. You had multiple weak spots, and the hands to this boss were actually weak points as well, just like certain Zelda bosses in the past. The patterns were pretty much like any Zelda boss you'd find. And the music? Oh boy. The music that you're hearing in this boss fight is none other than the variation of the main theme to Breath of the Wild. Wow, what a way to end off the whole thing. Compared to the gimmicky stuff we got from the first DLC, I think the second DLC introduced some very playable content. Robbie and Pora make one of the two playable characters in this game, and their moveset is very easy to learn. Aside from rarely ever getting the opportunity to actually play them, they are a solid duo to play as, and I would say it's worth the wait considering how easy it is to learn them. Unlocking them was a bit disappointing because it required you to beat the DLC's story, but I guess you can pretty much say the same with many other characters anyway, because the second character came with a lot of suspense. We didn't know who we were getting, and we also didn't know how to unlock this character. We found in several game files that there were multiple possibilities of who the secret character was, and we all had ideas for this new secret character. 4 prime candidates. It could have been Cass from Breath of the Wild, given his absence from the rest of the game. It also could have been Baby Sidon because it was somewhat hinted at the trailer, but that turned out to be some cutscene. Then was Sooga, badass right-hand man of Master Koga, and the leader of the Yiga clan. He was one of the few characters who was not in Breath of the Wild and was actually introduced in Age of Calamity. He's gotten fans ever since people saw that first trailer on Twitter. Another possibility would have been the game's actual antagonist, Astor, the man who seemed to cause Calamity that we saw in Breath of the Wild. Sure enough, both him and Sooga had a bunch of hints spread out all throughout the game. Both characters had audio clips found in the game files that would suggest that they both become playable characters, and both characters have been seen in situations where it would make sense for them to be played. They both had a high level of demand from the fans, and ultimately, we only got one of them. It was none other than Sooga. I think Sooga is by far the most broken character of the game, and I'm not just saying that from the perspective of playing the character, but also playing with or against him whenever he's an NPC. He's the only ally to be capable of committing friendly fire because of some weird glitch, but he's also one of the few playable characters with a moveset that makes him momentarily invincible, which for a game that requires pacing or attacks, it makes him incredibly broken. All characters have the ability to block. Some characters have the ability to deflect attacks with their shield, just like Link, but Sooga is the only character with a true ability to counter any attack. I wouldn't even consider it a high risk, high reward at this. He's just high reward, without question. And as someone who's been a fan of him since day one, I'm glad that they added him in. I do have to say though, unlocking him was the most arbitrary thing ever, and you didn't even need to complete the full DLC. It was hidden among one of the most secretive objectives ever in one of the most random missions of the game, and it required you to backtrack at a point where you thought you wouldn't be able to. The game had almost zero hints towards how to unlock him, and it blew my mind when the game straight up just let me start playing him. Nonetheless, I think he's my new favorite character of the game. And with broken character comes broken abilities. For a game that's already very easy with its number of unique abilities, the amount of added moves to almost every character in the game makes this game easier than it already is. And I'm talking about it from the perspective of playing at the highest difficulty setting, the one that was introduced in the first DLC. every flawed move in this game was remedied by something that's even more broken than the current moveset. Many of the characters received a new weapon that bolsters really high damage and pretty much throws the game off balance. There's not one thing I can think of that doesn't bring in any sort of small niche benefit. This game is really broken at this point, but enough of the gameplay. I think I've talked about too much about how this game was just incredibly easy. Back to the story, because I didn't want to go gushing about how I have over 300 hours in this game. The content that was introduced in this was more or less just adding to what we already know about the game's story. There wasn't anything that blew my mind other than seeing a real character's death and a few cameos here and there. The secret ending cutscene to this DLC was surprisingly not all that great, if I'm being honest. As a matter of fact, I'm actually kind of disappointed compared to the game's ending and even Champion's Ballad from Breath of the Wild. It did the complete opposite of what the rest of the game was trying to do, and it was pretending as if we were going through a serious, long adventure, and we finally got that wholesome moment at the end. All it did was flash through a few extra cutscenes that looked like they were just scrapped from the final cut, and mixed it up into a rushed and rather underwhelming celebratory ending that almost has zero context or even relevance whatsoever. It was so bad to the point that I was almost willing to bet that this DLC was rushed or development dropped earlier than it was needed to, because that last cutscene felt very out of place. I almost wanted to say that this was lazily made for that matter. But what bothered me the most was that this was all we got as an ending. It eliminated any sort of big emotions toward the base game's ending. It wasn't really any post-game content, and as a matter of fact, I can barely even classify this as something part of the game. Characters are casually like, hey, we're partying in the midst of the war, time to go back fighting now, type of thing. Everything leading up to this was well done, but then we have this. I want to say that this made the same mistake as Breath of the Wild by focusing on backtracking rather than looking ahead, but it was worse. Maybe better storytelling would be better off in a sequel or something like Breath of the Wild 2, but as it stands, the story included this DLC was just not enough, and it felt like it could have been easily put in the base game. I do have to give this DLC some credit for allowing us to revisit more locations from the past of Breath of the Wild, but there was not that much variation to these locations. I couldn't say they were as impressive as the ones in the base game. They were nice to see, but not to the extent of previous location. Overall, was there really enough content to justify that price tag? After all, this second DLC was the reason I chose to buy the expansion pass, not the first DLC. The amount of hours you get in total for just playing the second DLC is definitely not much, and I've heard people only spent 4 hours maybe on this DLC. As a completionist, maybe this does add more to the game. 50 or so more hours, more levels to complete on every difficulty, more characters to grind for experience points, a new goal to complete everything. Maybe it was just the right amount of story to give you a sense of completion, but not enough to hold you over for Breath of the Wild 2? I don't know, honestly. Looking back in retrospect, Age of Calamity wasn't just an ordinary game to me. Even though I had a lot of passion for Breath of the Wild and the rest of the Zelda franchise, I actually haven't spent as much time in a single playthrough as I have in Age of Calamity. Maybe it's just the game itself that warrants a longer playtime than something like Breath of the Wild. But most people ended their playthrough of Age of Calamity before they even hit the 50-hour mark. For me, Age of Calamity holds a special place in my heart because of much of my love for Breath of the Wild. I always fantasized what Hyrule was 100 years ago. I've done roleplays set in alternate universes of Breath of the Wild's history. A group of friends and I even written a fanfiction before Age of Calamity was even announced. People often came down to the consensus that Age of Calamity wasn't a serious Zelda game, and it was more of a stockpile of fan service, being some spin-off that you wouldn't give much more consideration because it wasn't important to Breath of the Wild. In my opinion, the base game did really well to hold its ground against that consensus, but the DLC did not. The DLC was unfortunately something that was never overly impressive to me as a whole, because the amount of great things I have to say, there are equally as many bad things to say about it. That doesn't necessarily mean I stopped appreciating this game. Age of Calamity gave us a whole lot of what Hyrule was supposed to look like 100 years ago, and we finally got more full-blown voice acting than we've ever had before. Age of Calamity still stands as a big, giant mirror to Breath of the Wild, and it still holds a place as something that's greatly expanded upon the world. The amount of content in this game still doesn't amount to half as much as the first Hyrule Warriors game had, but I suppose it's quality over quantity. Despite all that, this might become the next Zelda game that I will never touch again after playing too much of it. The amount of hype I had for this game was definitely one of the highest of all, only rivaled by the one game that we were actually waiting for this whole time. And with that, comes the epic conclusion. It might or might not be a conclusion, but who knows. I still have one more game to review, and you obviously know what it's going to be. That being said, does Age of Calamity move anywhere outside of its placement on B tier?